This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here, we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited to get to speak with Alia Hanna Habib, who is a vice president and literary agent at the Gernert company, where she represents MacArthur Fellows, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, National Book Award finalists, and numerous New York Times bestselling authors. She's also the author of Take It From Me, An Agent's Guide to Building a Nonfiction Writing Career from Scratch. So congratulations, Alia, on that book. The title alone, or I should say the subtitle alone, An Agent's Guide to Building a Nonfiction Writing Career from Scratch, makes me wonder why we haven't seen more books like this. I know at least among academics, agents often seem like one of the most mysterious parts of the whole publishing experience. Can you explain something about the agent's perspective on nonfiction writing?
Right. That was certainly one of the reasons I wrote the book. And I should say, too, that I'm ABD. I haven't been a fledgling academic for a very long time, but I do have still a bit of one foot in the academic world through my clients, through my partner. And I'm very aware of the phenomenon you're talking about. The idea for the book, the actual inspiration came out of doing a workshop at Stanford through their Public Humanities Center. And I remember when Mark Greif set it up and he explained that agents are seen as Pokemon, like these mysterious creatures. And like, where are they? Where do you find one? How do you catch one? So it was very important to me in the writing of the book to give the perspective of an agent, and more than one agent, there's lots of agents' voices that you hear in it, the perspective of editors, and to show us as real people operating in a field, in a cultural field, who make decisions and work interactively with writers and have information to share and are not these kind of distant on Mount Olympus gatekeepers, although some agents do act that way. But I would say there are two parts of the subtitle that I think are doing something different. It was the agent part, that an agent is being quite forthcoming. I tried to be quite forthcoming about the business, broadly speaking, and my own business in particular, my own history in particular, but also nonfiction. And that was really a real motivation as well, is that I do a lot of publishing panels, I give advice, and I found that I was wanting to send people resources for following up, but most of the resources that were easily available were geared toward fiction writers. And that's kind of in the cultural imaginary, when you think of a writer with a capital W, you think of a novelist. But that's not the whole sum of who writers are. And a lot of the advice that's floating out there is for someone who, wants to write a novel or write a romance or self-publish. And the path for someone who is, say, an academic who wants to write a crossover book is quite different. So I wanted to be able to codify some of the best practices in an accessible and very transparent way in a book.
That seems really important. Can you tell us a little bit about this nonfiction world for academics? I think we sometimes hear terms like creative nonfiction, literary nonfiction, like you just said, crossover. Is it important? Are these important distinctions?
Yeah, I would say the best way to think about a distinction is thinking about the book you want. There are genre distinctions. There are category distinctions, just as there are within academia. When you say, I, specialize in restoration comedy, that means immediately within your field, people know what you mean, rather than saying you specialize in, this is going to reveal how little I know about drama when I try to come up with another category of drama here in Shakespearean, Jacobean drama, comedy. But so these are distinctions, but they're distinctions that explain where your book sits on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say the first thing to think about is if you are an academic who wants to write a crossover book, broadly speaking, and by that I mean a book that is for audiences other than other academics in your field, think about, what do I read books that aren't by academics? If so, what kind of books and what kind of book would my book sit next to? And that's how to work backwards from figuring out what kind of book, if it is creative nonfiction, if it is literary biography, if it is just narrative history, if it is narrative nonfiction, is thinking, okay, so the book that I'm imagining, what other kind of books out there are like that book?
Right. Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense. As we were saying, getting the agent, you were alluding to this, often seems like this mysterious path. We've had people on this podcast who, some people have had folks, colleagues who've been able to introduce them to their agents, but we also have had people who've done, I think, the other kind of trick that, or hack that we all hear about, which is just reading the acknowledgments of books that we admire or that seem
Yeah.
close to our book and cold calling those agents. And people have had success. We're happy to hear that from our guests on the podcast. But I'm wondering what else you might advise for academics who don't have someone to introduce them.
Yeah, I write about this a bit in the book. I feel like I have special insight into academic neurosis from having been a grad student and being the partner of an academic. And it's almost like academics who are, in some ways, the most qualified of aspiring trade writers have the most anxiety about, or relatively more anxiety about reaching out cold to an agent than people who are far less qualified. I say with air quotes on paper. So the acknowledgments page of a book is a great way to research agents. So that's step number one is, do you do that work of saying, okay, the book that I want to write is kind of like these 10 books. You look in the acknowledgments. But then in your letter to your query letter, which is the word that we use to agents, that's where you mention why you're reaching out. And you want to be quite specific, and just as specific as you would be if you were applying for any sort of job. And think too about how your experience, your credentials would be most readily legible to someone who's not within your field. So think about, I always think that of an audience that you're writing for, and this is true in the audience of a book, but also the audience of, say, a query letter, your most curious undergrad. So, what would the version of your resume look like if you were explaining it to a really smart, bright, non specialist, a specialist who wants to understand what you're doing, but maybe doesn't get the jargon or the nuances or the distinctions? And that's how you should explain yourself if you're querying an agent. Say, hey, okay, why I'm choosing you. Like, you represent this. My book is project is similar in that way. I would say, too, wait until you at least have, ideally, a book proposal. But if not that, then ideally a strong project that you're pursuing. Most agents, unless they're pretty junior, aren't going to want to just meet with you for coffee to talk about your ideas. That wouldn't be seen as the best use of our professional time. Or, hey, I want to transition to trade publishing, or well, I want to write for a general interest audience. Can you meet up with me? I'm blah, 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 fancy professor of Renaissance studies. It would take a lot, unless you're like Stephen Greenblatt. We're probably not going to hang out with you. But if you have an idea, that's when you would want to reach out.
Yeah, I think I read an interview with you from a while ago, but I remember in one of your answers, you were explaining that in these queries or communications with agents, it was something like we should sort of try to sound like someone the agent would want to talk to, which just
Yeah.
seemed like very common sense human advice. But what has that meant in practice for you with writers?
A couple things. First of all, the thing that you're selling, you're actually demonstrating how you do. So in the case of a query letter, you are saying, I am a writer. And in the case of an academic, I am a writer who could write for a general interest audience. So if I get a query and it isn't interesting to read, it doesn't seem like something that is written by a mind that I want to spend time with, I'm probably not going to be that interested in responding. So think about that. You want to not be to thread the needle of being specific, but not too in the weeds, of being clear and concise and being respectful and engaging. And I would say too, there's sort of two ways that people err. And this is not to freak you out. So don't be too afraid to try. But one is too many ideas. So the version of this is, I have 5 book ideas that I would love to discuss with you.
Uh-huh.
And that's the feeling of, I'm going to be getting information from a fire hose. The other is something that is quite vague and too nebulous to understand what the person is actually wanting to talk about. So the email you want to respond to is one that has a specific idea or couple of ideas that seem graspable and legible and neither overwhelming nor nebulous.
Right. Yeah. I think one way that some of our guests have talked about writing that kind of query letter is to actually sort of delve right into the story in a
Yeah.
couple of sentences.
So this is my very reductive rhyme that I've stolen from a colleague of mine to describe exactly what should go in a query letter. And in a typical query letter, it's no more than a page. It's usually about 3 paragraphs. And here's the rhyme that'll never lead you astray, which is the book, the hook, and the cook.
Mm.
So the book is the book itself. And what should that sound like? The thing it should sound like is jacket copy, that the flap copy that you read on a book. So again, pull up that big stack of books that is kind of similar to what you want to write. See what the jacket copy sounds like. If you're a scholar, you should be able to quickly understand register and tone. The hook is why it matters. So why do we care? Why do we care if you're not an expert in a field? And then the cook is you. Why are you the person best qualified to tell this story? And if you have those elements, you have the elements of a query. So, book, the description, which you can leap right into. Not don't do too much throat clearing. Hook, why it matters. Cook, what's so special about you?
Related to that last point, some of our guests have mentioned these are academic writers that they've been somewhat surprised that actually their biography has played a role in how the agent sells the book, or maybe eventually how
Yeah.
the editor was, which isn't something we academics are always used to. Why or how is that the case in your experience?
Well, I give this advice when I talk about writing proposals, and I think it's good advice for thinking about how you talk about your book if it's a trade book to the public. So, in a proposal, and this is going to work back to the query, but it's, I think, just a mindset shift. In the proposal, if you Google book proposal, you're going to see some, not great advice that has you do the about the author, and it'll be usually in my idea of bad advice, third person, Rachel Gordon is the host of blah, blah, blah. And it's exactly the kind of information one can get from Googling you. I think a good author bio in a proposal, but in a truncated version, a very, very truncated version in a query, and in any discussion you have about your own book, is your own kind of intellectual history. How did you become the person who wrote this thing, who thought to write this thing? This doesn't mean you need to unload your trauma. Think about, though, it can often be quite interesting to say where the idea came from and then how you pursued the idea and how you chased the idea. And then maybe perhaps how the idea changed as you've gotten to know more about it. And that's often quite interesting to know about. So in a query, it could be a sentence or two. But I'll give you an example from a writer that I rep who did a biography of Anna May Wong, the first major Chinese American film star. And very quickly in her bio, she said, I first became interested in Anna May Wong when I saw a photo of her in the Museum of the Moving Image in Los Angeles, and I'd never seen. I was a very young woman, and I'd never seen an Asian American film star before, and she ended up researching Anna May Wong for over a decade, and just anchoring that. And then, she very quickly explained that she grew up as like a fourth generation Chinese American in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, and her family had always been, she thought of herself as a Californian as much as she did as Chinese American. And knowing about this woman whose family came to Los Angeles, to Hollywood at the same time as hers, was immediately intriguing to her. And it was very simple. It was like 2 sentences, but it grounded the reader in a sense of who this woman was and where her point of entry was, and also who Anna May Wong was very quickly. Like, oh, this is the figure that Anna May Wong is, and the space that she occupies.
About the query and the story that's being described, I know some of our guests have mentioned that they sometimes have pasted in the beginning of a proposal or just the beginning of sort of the introduction or kind of the beginning of the book, even though they haven't reached the point yet where an agent is asking them to send. What do you think of that move?
I'm personally agnostic, but what I would say is that a lot of agencies on their websites, they list what their submission requirements are. So just look at that. And I decide a lot of what I do based on the execution. So I don't mind seeing a little bit of a sample because then I know how the person writes. And that's so decisive for me. But it's not true for everyone. So some quite often an agent will say either on their own website or on their agency's website how they wish to be communicated with. And it's all there. And I would say too, for academics in particular, you can put your own research skills to use in this journey. It's this information, a lot of it is in my book, which you should definitely buy, but there is stuff you can find.
Right. About the proposal, we've heard from guests who've worked on this proposal with the literary agent that is then used to get the editor at the trade press. And it's often this big, much bigger than we academics are used to doing for
Yes.
academic presses. And it sounds like they really vary by agent. What do you like to work on with your authors?
Yeah. I love the process of developing a proposal. It's probably my favorite part of the job. And I have my own, we all have our own ways of doing it. There's certain general things you always have to do, but the ways that I do it. So I would say my overall philosophy is every section of it should be engaging to read. So I think that a lot of proposals die on the shoals of being boring. And when people Google a proposal, what they find is examples that read a bit like a PowerPoint. I never want to see a bullet point. I don't want to see stats. I don't want to see anything that feels like it's the voice from nowhere. That doesn't mean the proposal has to be super personal or revealing, but even when you get like I was saying, and you're about the author, I like to feel like I am getting to know someone beyond what I can Google. In the section of the proposal that talks about what some people call the marketing, I don't use that term. I want to feel, how is the person positioning their book in relation to other books in the field? And it should feel like you've read those books. You have something to say about the books that you are imagining yourself in relationship to. In the chapter outline, which is usually a part of the proposal where you talk about the chapters, I like to see some, if it's a narrative driven book, a sense of what the story will be and a sense of what the characters will be. So always, there's the approach to the proposal where it's box checking, or there's approach to the proposal where you're really thinking on the level of the sentence and the level of the pacing and the level of the organization. How do I make a compelling document? One that's compelling to read, because the person you're sending it to, an editor, is getting so many proposals and so much material. So it's in your best interest to make every part of it interesting, compelling, and to show that you can write, that you can communicate in writing.
Mhm. And can you tell us about, if someone has found an agent, sort of what happens next and what the author might expect in terms of the agent being in touch or not about shopping this proposal to editors?
Ideally, your agent is quite transparent and is sharing lots of information with you. So one of the things that drives me crazy is seeing depictions of how books are sold in TV shows and film. And don't ever watch a publishing movie with me, because I will just like spend the whole time like punching you in the arm. So often, you'll see this scene, which I think it's why authors are sometimes suspicious of agents, where the agent will call the author and say, "Hey, I sold your book." That's not a thing. That's not a thing. So the way it happens, the way it should happen, is Rachel and I work on her book. We work on her proposal. I put together a submission list. That's a list of people I'm going to contact at different publishers. I share it with Rachel. I show her who I'm sending it to. I say when I'm sending it. Often I'll share my pitch letter so she knows exactly how I'm positioning her book. And then in a couple of weeks, I start hearing back, and I share with with Rachel, that I've heard from these three people. And if I tell her who passes and then who is interested. So usually if someone is interested, they want to have a conversation with you. And then we set up a conversation with you and the editors that are interested. And then based on those conversations, based on the level of interest, I set a closing date for when I will accept offers for the book. And sometimes that is an auction. Sometimes there are other ways to sell books. But all of this you should be kept abreast, and none of it can be done without your permission. The book's rights are your rights, and that you are giving permission to sell. And should you get 5 offers for your book, it is up to you to whom you sell that book. And your agent's job is to try to negotiate the best deal possible based on the interest. but also to pair you with a party that you're excited about. So you can't be forced, to work with HarperCollins, even if you're not that interested in HarperCollins or whatever, or you're not forced even to go with the highest bidder for your book. You're ideally going to have conversations with a couple different parties, and your agent will then get offers from a couple different parties, and then you choose amongst them. And it often the decision isn't solely based on the highest offer.
So, I mean, it sounds like you're kind of acting in the writer's interest.
Absolutely. I mean, literally and legally, I'm the fiduciary. So our interests are aligned, and I should never be acting against a writer's best interest. And it's also not in my best interest to act against a writer's best interest. I work for them. If a writer can fire you, and writers do fire their agents. So I don't get paid. We should talk about how agents get paid. I don't get paid unless the book is sold, but I also am your representative in all your dealings with the publishing company.
That sounds like when if an author is lucky to have interest from editors, that you, because you've had experience with other authors in the past, might be able to provide some kind of insider information on what it might be like to work with this editor
Yes.
or in this press.
So yeah, to back up a bit. So sometimes a writer will be contacted by an editor, not an agent, and an editor will be interested in working with them. And I actually address this quite explicitly in my book, with editors saying many editors would say, even when that happens, they would prefer to have an agent negotiate the deal for a number of reasons, which I'm happy to get into. But first, when I'm putting together a submission list, if it's going the usual way, which is, agent and then editor, my putting together the submission list is based on my knowing different editors, is based on knowing not just what different publishers do, but what different editors within each publishing house is interested in, where they are in their career, what kind of work they're looking for. As I get to know a client, I get to know their working style. So some clients want a very hands-on editor. Some clients want an editor who maybe has a lot of experience, but is a little more hands-off. It really depends. And an agent's job is to know all those players and to know the differences. So I actually just had an example of I'm working with an academic, it's two academics, and they were contacted by a publisher. I contacted the authors. They were also contacted by a publisher about doing a book. Long story short, we did an exclusive deal with the publisher. And in this case, I was able to advise the authors in a number of ways. So I knew the editor, I knew the publisher, I was able to vouch for them, but also explain, okay, well, if you were to go exclusively with this publisher, what might you be giving up? If you're not shopping around, what are you giving up? What are the benefits of working with this publisher? How might they be different from another publishing house? What are they good at? What are their strengths? What maybe are their weaknesses? And then I negotiate the deal. So I always think, and this is important, an agent gets commission. That's how we get paid, 15% on the total deal. I always think I've at least earned my keep if I can get a 15% improvement on the initial offer. And in this case, I got a 50% improvement, and that's, can happen. And I think I paid for myself there, but that's another part of what an agent does. Is in addition to giving you information, which they very much should be able to do, ideally they can improve the terms of the deal in a number of ways. And also part of that is understanding the industry, knowing whether or not you're getting screwed. And I've had clients come to me after they've done maybe a deal without an agent and seen the terms and thought, yeah, maybe you undersold yourself. Of course, I believe in the work of agents, but I do see that an agent usually can get a stronger deal.
And in examples like that, when those academics were contacted by a publisher, by an editor, does this happen sometimes when an academic has published something popular or article or an essay? Mhm.
Yeah, it's usually somehow the academic has broken out of academia. So in this case, I don't want to reveal too much in case this is not yet a public deal, but they were profiled by a major magazine. And they had a couple of options. They could develop a proposal or go with this very, very excellent publisher who said, we're going to give you a book deal without a proposal based on what we know of your research. But that's a lottery ticket. That happens not that often. Typically, it's because you go through the usual steps of coming up with a book idea, developing a proposal, getting an agent. The agent then submits your book to publishers.
Speaking of expectations, this huge proposal that academics are often working on for the first trade press book they're doing, I've heard stories that maybe sometimes after that first trade press book, you don't necessarily have to do the big proposal.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that doesn't in fact happen.
Yes. So your first book is your audition for being an author. And it's not dissimilar from Hollywood. You hear about people who become famous. Once you become a famous actor, you no longer have to audition. So your second book, typically a book contract with a trade publisher, has what's in it is called an option clause, which means that your publisher has right of first refusal on your next book. They get to see it before anybody else does. The plus side of that is that they're saying essentially, I'm invested in you long term. I want to see what you're working on next. And typically there's a clause in there as well saying that they have to get back to you quickly once you submit that material. And also typically you don't have to write as much for the second book. You don't have to, you can do a shorter proposal, maybe not a sample chapter. Often what I do is a proposal and a sample chapter, both of about 40 pages each. But often for the second book, we do less because you've proven that you can write a book. You've proven what you're like to work with. Your editor knows you and ideally likes you and trusts you. So you don't have to show as much. We've all bought in.
Right. For many academics, humanities academics, especially who are considering trade, they've often written a first book, the tenure
Mhm,
book. So that's an
mhm.
academic book. Is anyone in the trade press world or the agent looking at that, the sales or anything to get a feel for you?
Typically, no, because
Hmm.
we know it's a different world. It establishes bona fides. It shows that you are taken seriously in your field. And especially for more literary publishers like Norton, like FSG, like Knopf, that is really important. With a more commercial publisher, like it's the way credentials are thought about is a little different. But in either case, what's called your sales track, it's really about your trade books. We understand that if you're being published by a university press, your book is largely being sold to libraries, and it's just a very different route than the trade route.
About this different world of trade press, I know many of our academic listeners actually wonder what is so great about this? Why is it worth all this extra work? And we've spoken to, many guests who've been down that path and have explained that they think it's more fun. They get to write in a more accessible way, reach more readers. And many have said they've gotten much more editing than they ever got from an academic press editor.
Yes. I mean, all of those things, I don't think that what's so great about it, if you come from a place of what's so great about it, you're probably not a person who wants to do it. It should come from a place of wanting to reach the audience that is an audience that is, I think, primarily beyond who you're typically talking to in your academic work and wanting to write. I see it as an opportunity. So I think this is true of all books, actually, is I get this question too. So I don't only work with academics, I work with a lot of journalists. And when I talk to journalists, what I often tell them is to think about their book as something they couldn't do in an article. You have an opportunity. In an article, you have 6,000 words or 10,000 words. With a book, you have 80 to 100,000 words. For an academic, as you know, what you're thinking about when you write your tenure book is a series of questions, a series of conversations within your field. But what if you had the opportunity to speak beyond your field? What would you do with that opportunity? And if that opportunity is exciting to you, then that's the place to begin thinking about a trade book. Of course, there's also how trade books are published, which is quite different. And yes, they tend to be, I don't want to throw academic editors under the bus, but the editorial process is often much more intensive. But also, the way that these books are positioned and sold to the public is quite different. So, a trade publisher first, their primary customer is bookstores and not academic. I mean, they also sell to libraries, but they're working to get your book into a range of accounts from Amazon to Barnes and Noble to Indies to, depending on how commercial your book is, Costco. They're working to get you publicity. They're working on your marketing. They're working to publish you in a different way than a university press, and that does not always work. It's a very very difficult proposition, but that is the goal, and it's a different goal than a university press, which isn't necessarily invested in making sure that your book is shelved at, you know, McNally and trying to get you on NPR and pitching you for op-eds in the New York Times and trying to get your book reviewed in, you know, the Washington Post and that kind of thing. That's not necessarily the goal of of an academic publisher.
Yeah, I've noticed that, some academics who are writing more popular are landing in academic presses that might have a trade division or just open to crossover, and they seem to be getting some of those get good attention.
Yeah.
What do you think of do some of your clients land there? Are they happy with that? Uh-huh.
Yes, and I think that could be a really good route. And I think it depends. It's a spectrum, right? It depends on where on the spectrum of academic versus trade you fall. For a book that's kind of so, for example, I have a book coming out I'm very excited about by a young professor of literature. She's an assistant professor. She hasn't gotten tenure yet. And she's being published by Princeton's academic trade division. So it is going to be a peer-reviewed book, but it's also going to be sold into bookstores and receive publicity and marketing. And this book is by Laura McGrath, who does sociology of books, history of the book, and it's about literary agents. It's a history of literary agents from World War II to the present and how literary agents have shaped American literature. And it does have, it's deeply researched, but it's also fairly narrative, and it also has, it's kind of juicy. And it makes a very an argument, but I could imagine it's a book that the New York Times would hopefully will review, and that I'm so looking forward to giving copies to my publishing friends that I could imagine a type of reader that's outside of academia for it. But it's still because it's a peer-reviewed book. She wanted it to be peer-reviewed because it was her tenure book. It is deeply researched. It made sense for it to have its foot in both worlds. And it was a really smart path for her. And I think that that book for Laura, it's a perfect home. I could see her doing something, maybe a literary biography that doesn't need peer review, that wouldn't belong in on an academic list. But for this kind of book, that makes sense for her.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about money. I know a lot of academics wonder if they're an
I love talking about money.
if someone is an unknown writer, academic, first time trade press author, what is reasonable to expect?
Yeah. So what's hard about talking about money with publishing, and I'm happy to talk about it as like I said, I love talking about it, but I'll just talk about the challenges first. Is that advances fluctuate. The differences are pretty wide. So first, I will say I want to disabuse you of the notion that being a first time writer means or debut writer means you'll get a lower advance. Statistically, that is untrue because advances are determined often by your previous book sales, and your academic book doesn't count. So often I'm in the best position to get a strong advance for a debut because your book sales are not compared to your own book sales, but to other successful books in your category. So for debut books, for nonfiction, it can range widely, but in a typical year, I sell books anywhere from occasionally mid five figures, more often a nice six-figure advance. It's not uncommon to sell a serious nonfiction book for seven figures if you're a well-established agent. Although typically for a seven-figure book deal, that's someone who's also, even if it's a debut, they're already a very well-established writer. But I've sold books by academics where we were in the, I'll just be frank, like the 200,000 to six or 700,000 even. That's a book which it's going there. It's very strong commercial potential, but it's not unheard of. So it depends on the book. It depends on the market at the time, but I'm not doing this. I mean, I love my job. I am passionate about books. I'm passionate about serious nonfiction, but I wouldn't be able to make a living if the advances were five-figure advances. No agent would be. Just the math of it means there has to be fairly consistent six-figure advances, or else there isn't even a reason to have an agent, and no agent would be able to support herself. So the money can be somewhat significant. That's also why we're fussy about what we take on. Is you have to imagine there's the potential for that kind of advance. Otherwise, your labor isn't compensated in a way that makes this a livable job.
Mm. How do you and or the editors assess commercial potential?
So it's become in the golden days, in the olden days, it was vibes. It was like, so loosey goosey. It was competition,
Mhm.
but it was also always based on other books. So that's why I've done things where I've had what's called a best bids auction, where everyone just sends in a bid for what they think a book is worth. I just had one, and literally the spread, like the difference between the high bid and the low bid, was exponential. So how do you decide? I mean, it depends on what numbers you're looking at. But specifically, what an editor does is they compare your book to other books that are similar. And then they look at the sales of those books, how well those books performed in the market. And then they put together a profit and loss sheet, a P&L. And that's how they decide what your book is worth. The art of it is that one editor will say, okay, here we have the next Jill Lepore. And Jill Lepore sold a lot of books. And another editor will say, this ain't no Jill Lepore. So that's why one person will offer 400,000 and another person will offer 40,000, and both will think they're right.
Yeah, huh. Speaking of Jill Lepore, I know a lot of academics wonder, should I be getting popular pieces out in sort of
Yeah,
magazines or Mhm.
that's certainly a very smart route if you want to eventually publish a trade book. And for a couple of reasons. First, I can't tell you how many clients of mine I found that way. One of my first clients that I signed as a very young baby agent, as young agents call themselves, was a then graduate student named Merve Emre, who's now become a very well known literary critic and literary scholar. And as a baby academic, she was publishing in the Los Angeles Review of Books. This was before she ever thought she'd be able to be published in the New Yorker, although Merve probably always knew she'd get published in the New Yorker. And I was a young agent, and that's what I was reading. And I read a piece of hers on Gone Girl, and I thought, this is a brilliant critic. And I wrote her an email, and she became one of my first clients. Or these professors that I saw profiled in a magazine, in this case, they said yes to being profiled. And they're very, very prominent in their field. And I wrote to them. So, in a way, it's a great way of sending out the bat signal to agents, to publishers, but also saying, I'm okay with engaging in conversations outside of academia. It sends a signal to me that you are interested in writing for an audience of lay readers, so to speak. And it's a way to learn that voice, because it's the most prestigious job one can get as a writer is writing a book. And it is running a marathon, and you don't just wake up one day and run a marathon. You train for it. And in many ways, those pieces that one writes that are smaller and shorter are a kind of training. You're learning your voice, you're learning what you want to write about, you're learning what interests readers, you're trying out ideas. It's lower stakes than writing a book. I don't see a downside. I think it can be really wonderful. And, often when someone, an academic friend, says, "Hey, I'm interested in writing a book," I talk to them and I'm like, that's not a book, but that's an essay. And you should write that essay and see what happens. And maybe writing the essay is you get it out of your system. Maybe writing the essay makes you realize what the book actually is. But it's, I think, a really wonderful intellectual, creative, and professional exercise.
How do we academics tell if it's an article or a book, or how do you assess that yourself?
I mean, there's no easy formula. I wish there were, because it's a question. I can't tell you how often I get a rejection that says, "I'd read this as an article." So there's no magic formula.
Mhm.
But I always think of it as the page 200 problem. And so how are you going to take this idea and make readers want to follow it from page 1 to page 200? And is there enough there? And sometimes when it's one, a couple of the tells that it's maybe not a book, is if it's a bunch of, you think it's a book, but it's actually a bunch of potted essays. I tend to like a book that has a through line, be it an argument that builds or a narrative. Another tell is if you find yourself having to be repetitive, or you're trying to bring in other things and you end up with a kind of overstuffed meatloaf to kind of flesh out the book. So it should feel like you are able to imagine a pathway to page 200.
Yeah. We've heard about how relationships between authors and agents really vary. What kind of relationships with your authors do you have?
Oh, I have a small list, and it's small on purpose. And I'm pretty close to a lot of my authors. And I do this job because I love working with authors. And my relationship with capitalism is such that I don't think your job you should think of your coworkers as your family. However, I do think that I feel like my authors are like my extended family. And I feel very much like with family, they often drive me crazy. But if someone else said anything bad about them, I would fucking destroy that person. Oh, can I say that on your podcast? And that kind of familial protectiveness is how I agent. It's how I feel like our relationship is probably a more helpful answer is the place where we could I'm the person that they could feel comfortable with, they could show their anxieties to, they could bring their concerns to, and then out in public, we're a united front.
Mm, yeah. And now that you're becoming a published author, are there things about becoming a book author that you understand more?
It's quite vulnerable. And I found that, well, for me, I also would say that I enjoy this process of the run up to publication more than I enjoyed the process of writing. I kind now I understand in my bones how hard it is to write a book. But I hope it's made me more empathetic. I really really get how hard it is and how you feel like my position as an agent isn't one where I'm asking for favors for myself. I'm usually asking for favors for my authors, and that part of it is just having to spend like weeks and weeks asking people to do stuff for you. It's hard, and I get how you get really tired of yourself. I prefer to be behind the scenes, and that part is really hard for me. But I think that also dispositionally, I'm just I don't think of myself as an author. I think of myself as an agent who wrote a book. And I think actually I see the way that my what I get neurotic about is not what authors get neurotic about. I get neurotic about my own author's success. I'm actually not that worried about my book's success. I derive my ego enjoyment from my success as an agent. And perhaps my publisher shouldn't hear that, but it's been interesting to see that distinction and that I don't think I'm wired that way and probably for the best.
Yeah. There's two questions that we ask all guests. And one is, what is something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career? And if you want to answer that for yourself or your writer's perspective.
This is a super practical thing that I learned while writing the book. And it is so basic and so obvious. But I started my book and I thought I would write it in order. And I also have this idea that I should do things that are hard, I idealize difficulty. And my first chapter in my book was the hardest to write just because of the subject matter. And I wasted so much time on that chapter. And finally, I said, I'm just going to skip ahead. And I actually looked at my list of chapters and I said, I'm going to write whatever is the easiest. And I wrote the easiest chapter first, and then I worked backwards from the easiest. I didn't write in order. And what I learned was that was amazing because I built confidence in myself as a writer.
Mm,
And I also got a lot of ground under my feet so that by the time I had to go back and write the hard chapter, I'd already written, my book is long, it's 100,000 words. I'd written 70 some thousand words. I had no doubt I could write a book. But when I was trying to write that hard chapter, I spent so much time thinking, am I really a writer? Can I write a book? Is this possible? But then when I went back and wrote the hard chapter, I just like, oh, it's a hard chapter, but I know how to write a chapter. I've written 6 of them. So my colleague actually told me to do it this way. And she called the idea of doing the hard thing first, swallowing the frog for breakfast. And she said, have you heard this term?
yeah.
And she said, every day at work, you're going to have to swallow a frog. Sometimes you want to swallow the frog for breakfast. It'll make your day easier, but you don't always have to swallow the frog. And I just like swallowed the frog for dessert and it was fine.
Yeah, that's funny. We had a guest who actually wrote a book called it was a title like eat your frog first. And it was, so I
But it's so
know,
funny.
yeah. So sometimes I agree. Sometimes I find that helpful. And sometimes I also feel like the getting a win and feeling encouraged by
Exactly.
that is the thing. In a way, you've just kind of answered this, but our other question is if there's a writing practice or habit that works for you.
I've interviewed writers about this, and the one that I have found the most helpful that I've stolen, and I think this is like a Hemingway practice, but productive writer. And I'm not going to be the first person who said this. So I actually have my own, and I have the Hemingway one, is to leave off at night when you know where you're going the next day. Mine was my little method was little treats. So this is also how I seriously did gain 30 pounds when I wrote my book. But when I was writing my book, I was living in a building with a vending machine, and I really do quite like candy. So I got myself a little treat when I got X amount of done each day. So I lived on gummy worms. And I also live around the corner from an amazing ice cream place. I had so much ice cream. And I just essentially it was an attitude that this is a time of my life when I'm not going to prioritize mm, vegetables. I'm going to allow myself certain indulgences to get through this. And it's a season in my life when that's allowed to happen, and it's not going to last forever.
Yeah, no, I don't know how it's possible to write without caffeine and sugar. And yeah, very important.
Yes. And now I am eating my vegetables again, and I'm glad, but I am so glad for the amazing ice cream I had maybe 3 times a week for 6 months.
That sounds great. Well, thank you, Alia. This has been really helpful and so much fun. And we're really looking forward to your book.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.